Hello everyone, Shintobean here with some Age of Sigmar content. I've been waiting for this day for a long time. At long last, we have a first look at the new Seraphon battletome that is coming out this summer. And so I made a bunch of reference cards for the new army rules, as well as Warscroll cards, so we can compare the old to the new and see what's changed. Although before we start, let's just have a moment of silence for the models that did not make it into the new battletome. So those are all the Cold One Riders, the Scar Veteran, and the Saurus Knights. Those guys are gone, along with the Eternity Warden, the Sunblood, the Razordon, and the Skink Priest. Now, let's take a look at the army rules, first of all. And one big change that appears to have occurred is that Seraphon no longer have army-wide abilities. Instead, everything is divided into either Starborn or Coalesced rules. So the Sacred Asterisms that were in the previous battletome are now gone, as far as I know. But looking at the subfactions, we still have the same four. For Starborn, we got Dracothian's Tail, which allows half of your army to deploy in reserve and then Deep Strike at the end of one of your movement phases. Wholly within 12 inches of a Cosmic Node, which is any Seraphon Wizard or Astrolith Bearer, and more than 9 inches away from enemies. The Fangs of Chotek are quite a bit different. You can now issue Redeploy 3 times per phase in your opponent's movement phase, and the first 2 times don't cost any command points as long as the target is a skink unit. So a lot more reactive movement on your opponent's turn. For the Coalesced, we've got Kodo's Claw, which gives all Saurus and Kroak units +1 to wound with their melee attacks after charging. And then the Thunder Lizard allows each of your monsters to make 2 monstrous actions at the end of the charge phase, and there are 4 new monstrous actions, 1 for each monster that are available for Coalesced monsters. Now, looking at the Starborn rules, there's a whole lot to digest here. I'll try to be as brief as possible. The Starborn no longer have 10 Bravery. That Bravery rule is gone. But for the Lords of Space and Time rule, it's now a heroic action for a Slann. So, first of all, Slann Starmasters no longer know all of the spells for their lore. So the first heroic action, Contemplations of the Old Ones, allows them to replace one of the spells they know. So for the Starborn, that would be from the lore of Celestial Domination. We do have different spell lores for Starborn and Coalesced. And then the second heroic action is Spatial Translocation, which allows you to teleport 1 unit that is wholly within 12 inches of a Slann anywhere else on the battlefield, more than 9 inches away from enemies. The key thing to note here is that because it's a heroic action, it happens in the hero phase. So you can do that before casting your spells, so you can set up some pretty crazy combos. I'm not going to get into what every single spell does here, but you can take a look and see what's new on the right-hand side there. Moving on to Summoning. This actually works in a very different way as well. So it's now called Cosmic Power. And previously you had to give up casting spells in order to gain summoning points, but now the reverse is true, where at the start of your hero phase you do generate 1 Cosmic Power point for each wizard, not just Slann, but also Skink Wizards, as well as Astrolith Bearers. And then whenever you successfully cast a spell that is not unbound, or successfully unbind or dispel an enemy spell, you also generate 1 Cosmic Power point. So you can imagine having a bunch of wizards, you can generate those Cosmic Power points very quickly. And now you can spend those power points on 3 new abilities. As seen on the left, we've got Azure Light, which can return D3 slain models to each Seraphon unit with 1 or 2 wounds characteristic, wholly within 12 inches of any cosmic nodes. And that's for 5 points. For 10 points, you can use Protection of the Old Ones, which improves the Astrolith Bearer's 6+ ward into a 5+ ward until your next hero phase. And then finally, for 15 Cosmic Power points, you can Cleanse the Realms, which deals mortal wounds equal to the roll for each enemy unit within 12 inches of any cosmic nodes on a 2+. So that can do anywhere from 2 to 6 mortal wounds for each enemy unit in range. And those happen in your hero phase. So you can spend those Cosmic Power points on those, or you can just summon new units to the field. You'll notice looking at this list that there are actually no heroes that you can summon. You can no longer summon Carnosaurs, but there's plenty of good options there. Moving on, we've got the Starborn Artifacts of Power and Command traits. For the Starborn, those are either for Slann or Skink heroes and generals. And I'm not going to get into it, but there's a lot of new stuff here. Moving on to the Coalesced rules. Predatory Fighters gives +1 to bite rolls for Saurus and Kroak units. So the way that Jaws attacks work is very different now. It's no longer a melee weapon attack. Instead, you make a roll after the unit fights and then on a 6+ it deals mortal wound. But that is improved to a 5+ for coalesced units, and it actually goes down to 4+ if they're near a coalesced Realmshaper Engine as well. And that is for Saurus on foot and Kroak units. Scaly Skin functions in the same way. It's -1 damage from enemy attacks to a minimum of 1 to all friendly Saurus, Kroak, and monster units. And then for the monsters, they again have these new monstrous rampages available in addition to the regular ones. So for the Carnosaur, it can just devour an enemy model. If you roll higher than its wounds characteristic, it just dies. The Stegadon has a 50-50 chance of making a target unit strike last in combat. The Troglodon has a new ability which gives a -1 to hit debuffing aura to everything within 9 inches, but you can increase that to 12 inches with this monstrous rampage. And then the Bastiladon has a pretty nice wave clear ability. It doesn't do anything against single models, but if there are a bunch of models attacking it, it can potentially deal a lot of mortal wounds with the bludgeoning sweep. And then the Coalesced have their own spell lores here for Slann and Skink wizards. Then we've got the Coalesced artifacts and command traits for Slann and Saurus heroes and generals. But let's move on and take a look at the Warscrolls. So we've got the old Warscroll on the left, and then the new one on the right. Saurus Warriors have an awesome new model. They're much more beefy and menacing looking, and their stats reflect that. So they now have 2 wounds apiece, and their weapons hit harder. They have 2 attacks, and the clubs hit on 3s, and the spears have rend -1. They no longer get the +1 to attack for having 15 or more models. That was kind of a dumb rule, so I'm glad that's gone. Instead, they get +1 to their save while contesting any objective on the field or while in your territory. So for much of the battle, these guys can have a 3+ save. And then, of course, they've got the Jaws, which for this, it's 1 bite per model within an inch of the enemy unit. So this one is not super good because your enemy could just pull casualties off of the front row, which would lessen potentially the number of bite attacks you can actually make. But I'm still really glad that they simplified the Jaws into just a single roll instead of having to roll all those extra dice in combat. Saurus Warriors are now 200 points for just 10 of them. Next up are the Saurus Guard, which did not get a new model. Pretty much the same stats, but they do have a 3+ save now, and 1 more inch on their weapon. Their Selfless Protector's ability now can prevent damage to any of your Seraphon heroes, not just Slann, and that happens on a 3+ instead of the 2+. Then we've got the Skinks. They've got a nifty new ability, Swift and Nimble, which allows you to roll 2 dice when running or redeploying, and then just pick one of them. That's quite useful. The shields are actually a little bit different too. It's +1 to their save characteristic, not just +1 to the save roll. So now Skinks with shields will have a base save of 5+, which could go down to a 4+ if you use all-out defense. The champion gets +1 to all of its attacks for all of its weapons. One thing I actually didn't include on these Warscroll cards is banners and musicians, which Skinks don't actually have, but for the standard bearers and musicians all actually do the same thing, where the banners give +1 to bravery, and the musicians give +1 to run and charge rolls. Now that Seraphon can have their bravery modified, that is a thing now. So anyway, looking at the Skinks' weapons, the javelins are pretty much the same, except they now have rend -1. They do hit on 4s and wound on 5s instead of the reverse. Bolt Spitters now hit on 4s. The clubs hit on 4s as well. However, the Skinks no longer get an extra attack for having 15 or more models, so having massive reinforced units of Skinks is no longer as effective as it used to be. Next up, we got the Kroak, which also got their model updated, and now there are 2 variants. The regular Kroak actually have pretty much the same stats as before. However, their abilities are a bit different. Skink Guidance allows the Kroak to receive commands from Skink champions while they're wholly within 12 inches. The Vice-like Jaws, again the simplified bite attack for Kroak is 3 bite rolls per model. And then Sweeping Blows affects both the Drakebite Maul as well as the Moonstone Hammer. So 6 is to hit, score 2 hits instead of 1 if the target unit has 10 or more models. The Moonstone Hammer no longer hits everything in range, it just has 4 attacks, but it hits on 3s and does 3 damage. And then we got the Warspawn variant with the Crocodilian Head, and these guys are pretty much the same, except their weapons are slightly different. they have Ren -2, but 1 less attack. They can get 1 more attack if any skink models wholly within 12 inches were slain in combat, but that seems very situational. Don't know how often that's actually going to happen, so not a great ability there. Heavy Scaled Skin is pretty useful though, -1 to be wounded by missile weapons, so they're a little bit tougher against those ranged attacks. Moving on, we got the old Chameleon Skinks are gone in name, but they've been replaced by the Hunters of Huanchi, which the ones with dart pipes are essentially the same thing. The only difference is to Perfect Mimicry rule, which makes them invisible while in cover or if more than 12 inches away from enemies, so they just can't be targeted at all by ranged weapons. And then we've also got a sort of short-range variant with the Bolas, which can stun the target with their ranged attack, giving it -1 to hit until the end of the combat phase. Also new with the Hunters Huanchi are the Terrawings. They're pretty weak, but they can sort of disrupt the enemy by preventing enemy units from issuing or receiving commands in the shooting phase, and they can also deep strike alongside the Hunters of Huanchi when they deploy to the field. So the old Saurus Knights on Cold Ones are gone, and they've been replaced by 2 new cavalry units. First of all, we've got the Raptadon Hunters, which are Skinks, and these guys have 2 variants, ranged and melee. The ranged one are the Hunters, armed with the special javelins. They have 2 attacks, hit on 4s and wound on 4s, Ren -2, but they can fire again in the charge phase, I believe, after a unit of Raptadon Chargers successfully charges an enemy unit. So having both of these guys on the field at the same time and using them together, they synergize well and can get a bonus to their attacks. The Chargers get +1 to hit with their lances against a unit that was fired upon by the Hunter's javelins that turn. And then Geomantic Empowerment increases the damage of their lances while contesting an objective or while within 3 inches of terrain with the Arcane rule. They've got just 2 wounds and a 5-up save, and they are on the same base size as the old Cold One Knights. So what I actually did was I took some Skinks with javelins and just put them on Cold Ones, and I think for now I'm just going to call them Raptadon Hunters. Now for the Saurus, they've got these new bulky Aggradon Lancers, which come 3 for a unit for 210 points. They've got 5 wounds apiece, 4-up save, and they have a pretty strong attack, and their Primal Rage rule increases the number of attacks that the Aggradon mount has with its bites and talons the longer it stays in combat, so it can potentially get up to 6 attacks, and those are with Ren -2 and 2 damage, so a lot of damage there. The Scar Veteran on Aggradon is the hero version, which combos well with the Lancers. He can use an Alpha Roar once per battle to increase the rage of all of your Aggradon Lancers, and also the Scar Veteran himself by 1. The Primal Rage does start at 0, and then it resets to 0 when your guys leave combat, though. Moving on, the old Salamander model is now gone, and has been replaced by the bigger Spawn of Chotek. This thing is on a much larger base, and it's actually quite a bit different. It's fewer points, first of all, 125 points. It's got 8 wounds, and the Skink handlers function differently. In the past, those Skinks could be picked off individually, but now the crew and the Spawn of Chotek itself count as a single unit. So I guess the handlers cannot actually die. They're only removed once the thing has suffered 8 damage. So you don't have to worry about like them running away from battle shock. And it now has 2 attack types. It has a long-ranged Glob of Flame Acid, 24-inch range, only 1 attack, so it's not very reliable, but if it hits and manages to wound an enemy, then the target gets -1 to save until the end of the turn, which cannot stack if you use it multiple times on the same unit. The Stream of Fire can be quite good. It can get up to 10 attacks. It's equal to the number of models in the target unit. And Ren -2, 1 damage. So the thing no longer does mortal wounds like the Salamander, but it just overall feels a lot more balanced. Terradon Riders are pretty much the same. The Bolas now wound on 4s, so that's a little bit worse, but they do get a flat 4 attacks. The Javelins have Ren -1, and they are now -1 to be hit by missile attacks. The Terradon Chief is quite a bit better. It's got an additional wound. The Skyblade does 1 more damage and wounds on 3s. And then the coordinated attack is the biggest difference here. So previously, I think the old Chief could only use it on 1 unit of Terradons, and it was a command ability. But now it's just a once per battle thing, and you can just apply it to all of the Terradons within range. So you can just, on one turn, go on this massive bombing run and deal mortal wounds on a 2+. And the Terradon Chief itself can also drop the rocks, which the old one apparently couldn't. Ripperdactyl Riders are also quite a bit stronger. If you look at their attack profile, the Moonstone Spear has 2 attacks. The Jaws now have Rend -1 and deal 2 damage. And then, like the Terradons, they have -1 to be hit by missile attacks, but also Unleash Hell only hits them on 6s. And the Blot Toad is quite a bit better as well. For the previous version, it was just a once per battle during the combat phase, but now at the start of the game you designate one unit that will be marked by a toad, and then all of your Ripperdactyl Jaws attacks will get +1 to hit and wound against that unit for the whole game. The Ripperdactyl Chief also gets his own toad, which makes him pretty good. The Ripperdactyl Assault ability, I believe, is still the same. Yeah, just +1 attack to all the melee weapons of your Ripperdactyls. Now, let's look at some monsters. The Bastiladon is quite a bit different now. The biggest difference you can see at first glance is that the new Bastiladon no longer brackets, so its save and attacks no longer degrade as it takes damage, which is huge. The thing has 2 more wounds than before, and just a flat 2+ save. And then the Solar Engine doesn't get nearly as many attacks, but it now hits on 3s, has Rend -3, and deals 3 damage. Also, worth noting, it can no longer fire twice per turn with Thunder Lizard. That is now a relic of the past. The Arc of Chotek is quite a bit better as well, 20 attacks. It still hits on 4s and deals mortal wounds on 6s, but it gets a 3+ to wound now instead of the previous 6+. The tail attack is still the exact same, and of course if you're running Coalesced Bastiladon, don't forget about the Monstrous Rampage, which is quite useful. The Stegadon now has 4 more wounds than before. It went up to 300 points, and it counts as 10 models for the purposes of contesting objectives. Armored Crest still functions in the same way. The Stampede now deals mortal wounds on a 2+ instead of 3+, and then Steadfast Majesty gives +3 Bravery to all non-Stegadon Skinks, wholly within 12 inches. It now brackets a lot more slowly. Previously, monsters only had to take 3 damage before their stats started getting worse. Now they have to take 6 damage before bracketing, so that is a huge improvement there. The Stegadon's weapons are, I believe, all the same, other than the javelins, so nothing has changed there. I didn't include a separate card for this, but the Stegadon with Skink Chief hero version is still there as well. And for that one, I believe the Coordinated Strike ability just allows it to issue a command once per turn to a skink without spending the CP. Now the Engine of the Gods, this thing has gone through some dramatic changes, and it's kind of a mess, honestly. I don't know how good this is really going to be. The same changes to the Stegadon itself apply. It does have 14 wounds, and it's the same amount of points as the regular Stegadon, but the Cosmic Engine is completely different. So now you can choose to either charge the energy or release the energy each turn. So for each turn that you charge it, you can roll an extra dice for when you release the power. Normally you just roll 2d6, but yeah, so you can roll 3d6 after charging it for 1 turn, 4d6 if you charge it for 2 turns, and then you can also choose which of the 4 abilities you want to use. So Healing Light is the easiest to get off, and it just heals d3 wounds to each Seraphon unit, wholly within 12 inches. However, the other abilities, so we've got, the one that deals mortal wounds at range, one that gives your Seraphon units the ability to strike first in combat, and then the most difficult ability to get is the summoning 10 Saurus Warriors, 20 Skinks. Those are all very difficult. You have to roll extremely high in order to get them to successfully cast. So it looks like you'll just have to spend several turns charging the engine just to use one of these abilities like once per battle. So it doesn't really seem that great, a little bit too big of a risk to be very reliable. So I don't know, let me know what you think about the new Engine of the Gods. Also, a big thing to note is it's no longer a hero either, so you can no longer give artifacts of power or anything like that. But let's look at the heroes. The new Oldblood, its attacks are pretty much the same as the Sunblood, except it does 2 damage, but its abilities synergize with Saurus Warriors and Saurus Guard infantry units specifically. So, Predatory Exemplar, in the combat phase, he can get a Saurus Warrior or Guard unit wholly within 12 inches to immediately fight after he fights. And then Wrath of the Seraphon, whenever he issues all-out attack to Saurus Warriors or Guards, it gives them +1 to wound in addition to the +1 to hit. And then Mighty Saurus Jaws, this is the bite attack for heroes, Saurus heroes, and that's 3 bites per model. Next up is the Oldblood on Carnosaur. So this thing has 3 more wounds than before, up to 15 wounds. And Ancient Warlord is a very useful ability. It allows him to issue the same command twice in the same phase with no command point being spent for the second command. Frenzy is better, I believe. After it kills a unit, it gets +1 to wound with the Carnosaur's attacks for the rest of the battle, so that's the Jaws and Claws will be wounding on 2s. Terror is a lot better. Enemies in combat with the Carnosaur cannot receive the Inspiring Presence command, much better than the previous one, which was just -1 Bravery. Of course, it brackets a lot more slowly. As for the weapon profiles, the Sunbolt Gauntlet, I believe, is the exact same. The weapon is a little bit weaker, maybe? I don't know. It's got 2 more attacks, but deals 1 less damage and no longer gets like additional hits on 6s. And then the Jaws and Claws are pretty much the same. And don't forget, for Coalesced, you do get that special Monstrous Rampage. The Scar Veteran on Carnosaur is pretty much the same as the Oldblood on Carnosaur, except it doesn't have the ranged attack. And its ability is different: Maim and Tear. At the end of combat, pick 1 enemy unit within an inch and roll dice equal to, basically, I think it's the damage the model has taken overall, and then for each 5+, it deals an additional mortal wound. So this guy's just a beat stick. The Oldblood is the one who's more of a leader, issuing all those commands and stuff. Alright, we've got the Astrolith Bearer here. This guy's pretty much the same. His abilities are the same. Able to extend the range of your spells by 6 inches, very useful. And then the 6+ ward to everything holy within 12 inches. He does get the Mighty Saurus Jaws. And his weapon now has a 2-inch range. He gets 1 more attack and deals 2 damage. But he's 20 less points, so improvement there. The Slann Starmaster got a new model. A much bigger model. It's actually on a larger base. I think it's an 80mm base, the same size as Lord Kroak. He has 2 more wounds than before. His spell casting is pretty much the same. He still casts 3 spells, +1 to casting and unbinding. He can unbind things anywhere on the field. But again, he no longer knows all of the spells, so you just have to pick 1, and then you can swap it out if you use the heroic action. Most of the abilities are still the same. He's still got Arcane Vassal, so he can cast spells through other wizards. I guess the other wizards have to be within 12 inches. The Oracle can be anywhere on the battlefield. He's still got the CP generating ability, Foresight. Gift of the Heavens is the same. And then he's got 2 Warscroll spells now. Celestial Equilibrium. Casts on 6 and gives +1 to all of your other wizards casting this turn. Which is more useful now, I think, especially with Starborn, because you get those cosmic power points whenever you cast a spell. Shield of the Old Ones, cast on a 7, gives the Slann itself a 4+ ward versus mortal wounds until your next hero phase. And then his combat attacks hit on 3s, so just slightly better. It's not really a massive change to the Starmaster if you just look at the Warscroll in isolation. But I think if you look at the new spell lores and sort of the combos and the summoning and all that, this is still definitely a very powerful hero. Lord Kroak is way better, to the point where it's actually pretty ridiculous. This guy, so he's now a War Master, counts as a general, even if he's not picked to be your general. He still gets the +2 to casting and unbinding. He knows all of the spell lores for Coalesced or Starborn, depending on which army you're running. Still got the same CP generating ability. He now has a new ability called the Golden Death Mask. So in the combat phase, you roll 2d6 for 1 enemy unit of your choice within 12 inches, and if your roll exceeds the bravery, that unit fights last in combat. Celestial Deliverance is much better. It now casts on a 7+, and you can cast it any number of times per turn, so up to 4 times. It's got a 12-inch range. And now it just does, straight up does D3 mortal wounds to 3 visible units within range. So you don't have to roll on a 2-up anymore. Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous. His combat attacks now deal mortal wounds as well. And it's equal to the number of models in range, just like it was before. And then dead for innumerable ages is still the exact same as well. But yeah, just the changes to Celestial Deliverance is pretty crazy. And he's cheaper, apparently, as well. Next up, we got the Oracle on Troglodon. So this thing has 2 more wounds, up to 14 wounds. And it no longer is able to cast Comet's Call. It now heals D3 wounds on your hero phase, and you don't have to roll for it. Terror, just like with the Carnosaur, prevents Inspiring Presence from being received. And then I mentioned this before, but Stench of Death. Enemies within 9 inches get -1 to hit with all attacks. Definitely a useful ability there. It now has its own unique Warscroll spell, Primordial Mire, which casts on a 7. You pick 1 objective or terrain feature within 12 inches, and every non-skink and non-flyer unit cannot run or retreat, and their charge rolls get halved until your next hero phase. It brackets a lot more slowly, and its attacks are definitely stronger. The ranged attack now has a flat 3 attacks, and then the Venomous Jaws and Claws actually have Rend now, and the Jaws deal 3 damage, and also the Noxious Spittle and Venomous Jaws deal mortal wounds equal to the damage characteristic if you roll a 6 to hit. So, just a bit stronger there in combat. The Skink Starpriest is pretty much the same. I think the only difference is that it lost its ranged attack, and its melee attack is slightly better, 2-inch range, and deals D3 damage, although you don't really want this guy fighting, but still very useful. The Serpent Staff, being able to deal mortal wounds, is pretty nice. Then we got the Skink Starseer. This thing also got a new model. This thing is a fair bit different. It's got 1 more wound. It lost its ranged attack as well. It also lost its CP generating thing, which also the Skink Starpriest does not have that anymore. But its new ability, Scry the Stars, once per battle. In your hero phase, you can roll dice equal to the current battle round, and for each 2+1 Seraphon anywhere on the battlefield gets a 5+ ward until your next hero phase. And then his Warscroll spell, Celestial Doom, casts on a 7 and removes the ward of an enemy unit within 12 inches. And then we got the Realmshaper Engine, the faction terrain piece. This thing is quite a bit different as well. It's no longer defensible. Instead, it's impassable, so you can't move over or onto it. And it's different whether you run a Starborn or Coalesced army. So for the Starborn, it actually has the same ability as before, except the wizard just has to be within 3 inches. And then for the Coalesced one, this is quite useful. While wholly within 12 inches of this, Saurus and Kroak will get +1 to their bite rolls, and monsters do not bracket. Finally, we got the Starblood Stalkers. This is a newer edition. They weren't in the old battletome, but they have been available. I'm not really familiar with them very much, so I didn't include the old ones here. So it's just a group of 3 units, but you have to take them as a set for 290 points now. And the priest Kixitaka, he has an ability which can, on a 2+, prevent an enemy within 6 inches from contesting the objective until the start of your next turn. Troak, the little Oldblood there, he gets a little stronger when nearby the priest. He gives +3 bravery to the other Starblood Stalkers. And then the Starblood Stalkers themselves is a group of 4 Skinks. These guys have 2 wounds apiece. They got 2 dart pipes and 4 celestite weapons between the 4 of them. The dart pipes deal mortal wounds on 6s to hit, and they can also protect the priest, redirecting damage on a 3+. So that is it. That was a lot of stuff there, but lots of exciting changes to the Seraphon. I have been holding off on playing them for a long time just in anticipation for the rules, but now that they've dropped, I'm really looking forward to bringing the full might of the Seraphon to the tabletop and seeing how they perform with these new rules. Let me know if you have any questions. Also, I apologize if there are any typos in here. I did have to type all this by hand, and I do make mistakes, but yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. But thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.